In the cold, marbled halls of American power, political combat is rarely a spontaneous affair. It is a performance, a piece of theater meticulously choreographed for the unblinking eyes of the cameras. What you are about to read is the story of one such performance, a calculated assault by a young revolutionary icon against an old guard conservative. It was designed to be a viral moment, a triumphant execution live on national television. She came armed with righteous fury and the adoration of her followers. Utterly convinced of her own victory, she was completely, tragically unaware that she was not the hunter, but the bait, and that she was walking into a carefully constructed trap from which there would be no escape. This is a masterclass in political destruction, and it began, as so many tragedies do, with an act of supreme and fatal arrogance. The sound was a gunshot, a sharp, percussive bang as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's fist slammed into the mahogany committee table. The impact sending a sheaf of papers scattering like startled birds. At 35 years old, the congresswoman from New York's 14th district commanded the room with the kinetic fury of someone who did not just believe she was on the right side of history, but was certain she was its chosen instrument. "You're a climate denier who abandoned Texas to freeze." The words cracked through the House Financial Services Committee hearing room like a whip. In the gallery, a sea of young progressives in "Tax the Rich" t-shirts erupted in a coordinated, well-rehearsed chant, "Shame, shame, shame." Camera flashes strobed across the room like lightning, each one capturing what Ocasio-Cortez was certain would be her defining viral moment, the young revolutionary, the voice of a generation, taking down the old guard. Across the dais, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas sat calmly, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the expression of a seasoned poker player holding 4 aces while his opponent furiously goes all in on a pair of 2s. As papers from AOC's dramatic gesture fluttered down around him, he methodically reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and began to clean his wire-rimmed glasses, unhurried, as if the storm of fury breaking around him was a minor and uninteresting weather event. The room itself seemed to vibrate with a manic energy. Every seat was filled, mostly with young supporters who had lined up hours early for the spectacle. Behind Ocasio-Cortez, her political allies, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, stood in formation, a silent backup choir, nodding in synchronized solidarity. The air was thick with the smell of nervous energy and expensive coffee. The electronic buzz of dozens of phones recording every second adding an undercurrent of digital anxiety to the chaos. Ocasio-Cortez, feeding off the energy, grabbed another stack of papers. It didn't matter what was written on them. They were merely props for the performance, and hurled them in Cruz's direction. They fluttered and fell, a theatrical but wholly ineffective gesture. "You want to lecture me about serving the people?" Her voice climbed higher, edging toward a screech, while Texans froze in their homes. "You were sipping margaritas in Cancun, while children died for lack of heat. You were working on your tan." The gallery's response was immediate and deafening. The "shame" chant grew louder, more intense. Her chief of staff, standing just off to the side, tried to catch her eye, to give a subtle signal to pull back. She was burning too hot, too fast. She shook him off irritably. This was her moment. "You represent everything wrong with this system," she was pacing now. A caged tiger of righteousness. Rich politicians who serve themselves while working families suffer. Cruz continued to write his notes, not even looking up. The deliberate, almost insulting dismissal infuriated her more than any retort could have. She leaned over the table, too close to the microphone, causing a piercing shriek of feedback that made people wince. "You flew to Mexico while your state suffered." She delivered what she believed was the final killing blow. "You abandoned them. You're a coward who only serves the rich." She stood, breathing hard, her face flushed with the exhilaration of victory. This was it, the viral clip, the speech that would be shared millions of times. The moment Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez indisputably destroyed Ted Cruz on live television. And then, the room began to quiet. The chanting died away, sputtering out like a car engine running out of gas. A new kind of silence began to descend, heavy and anticipatory. Cruz finished writing his final note. He set down his pen with a soft, deliberate click. He removed his glasses. He cleaned them again with his handkerchief. Each slow, circular swipe of the cloth stretching the silence to an almost unbearable length. Finally, he replaced his glasses and looked up, his gaze calm, his expression almost mild. When he spoke, his Texas drawl was conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "Congresswoman, are you quite finished?" The simplicity of the question was devastating. It was the tone of a patient teacher asking a child if they were done with their tantrum, politely waiting for the emotional outburst to conclude so the adults could resume their conversation. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth to launch another volley, but Cruz held up a single finger, a quiet, simple gesture to wait. He then reached for the plain, unremarkable manila folder that had been sitting on his table. As his hand touched it, a visible shift occurred in the room. The Republicans, who had been leaning back with knowing smirks, now leaned forward in their seats. The Democrats, who had been looking uncomfortable, now seemed to shrink back. A silent, collective cringe. Cruz opened the folder with theatrical slowness. He pulled out a single, 8x10 glossy photograph and held it up for the entire room to see. The image was of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, radiant and smiling in a flowing white gown at the Met Gala. Emblazoned across the back of the dress in bright, blood-red letters were two words: "Tax the rich." The cheers from the gallery died as if a switch had been thrown. The silence that followed was so absolute, so profound, that the low, electronic buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead became an audible hum. Ocasio-Cortez froze, her hand still pointing, her confident smile cracking like thin ice. Her other hand reached for the table, needing something solid to hold on to as the world began to tilt on its axis. The trap had been sprung. Of course, here is the second part of the narrative, picking up at the moment the photograph is revealed. Part 2. The unveiling. The photograph was a mirror, and the reflection it showed was one Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could not bear to see. The cheers from the gallery had died as if strangled, the sudden silence so complete that the low buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead became an oppressive hum. Her pointing hand, which had been a weapon of righteous accusation, now trembled, suspended in midair. The confident, revolutionary smile she wore in the photo seemed to mock the pale, dawning horror on her face in the hearing room. Her other hand found the edge of the table, gripping it, needing something solid to hold onto as the world tilted on its axis. Senator Ted Cruz let the image hang in the air, a silent, damning indictment. He did not smile, he did not gloat, he simply waited, allowing the profound hypocrisy of the scene, the socialist icon in the "tax the rich" gown, posing happily at the most exclusive party of the global elite, to do its work. "Before we discuss my travel arrangements, Congresswoman," Cruz said, his voice still quiet, still conversational, "perhaps we should discuss yours. Specifically, your attendance at the most expensive party in America as the guest of billionaires." He let the phrase, "guest of billionaires," settle into the room. A poison dart aimed at the heart of her political brand. Ocasio-Cortez struggled to regain her footing, to redirect the narrative that was slipping from her grasp. This is about your corruption, not mine," she stammered. But the power, the fire, had drained from her voice. It was the weak protest of someone who knew they were caught. "This is a distraction from the real issues." "Is it?" Cruz asked, his tone one of genuine curiosity. He reached into his folder and pulled out another document. This one had an official letterhead, the seal of the United States Congress clearly visible, because the House Ethics Committee, just last month, seemed to think it was a very real issue. The color drained from her face entirely. She knew what that report said. She had spent sleepless nights dreading this exact moment, this public unveiling. Her legal team had assured her it would blow over. The progressive media had promised to bury it. Her allies in the squad had sworn to stand by her. But here it was, in Ted Cruz's hands, on national television, in front of God and C-SPAN. "You want to talk about serving the rich?" Cruz continued, his voice never rising, never showing triumph, just methodically presenting facts. "Let's talk about who paid for your designer dress that night. Let's talk about who paid for your professional styling, for the jewelry, For the ticket for your boyfriend to attend. Her hand trembled as she reached for her water glass, only to find it empty. A casualty of her earlier performance. An aide, his own hands shaking, rushed forward with a replacement. She drank from it too quickly. Coughed, a trickle of water dribbling down her chin. Her eyes darted toward the squad members who had been her steadfast honor guard. Ilhan Omar would not meet her gaze. Rashida Tlaib was suddenly absorbed in studying her phone. Ayanna Pressley had discovered something of profound interest in the ceiling tiles. They were creating distance. The ship was sinking, and they were quietly backing away from the breach. The progressives in the gallery were whispering now, a confused murmur spreading through the rows as they pulled out their phones. Frantically Googling. AOC Met Gala ethics. I borrowed the dress, she stammered, the panic evident in her voice. I always intended to pay. Cruz finished the sentence for her with surgical precision. Eventually, after you were caught. He then began to arrange more folders on his table. A whole stack of them. Each one a potential new front in a war she was already losing. Congresswoman, he said, and his tone was almost gentle. The dispassionate voice of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. You attacked me for one trip to Cancun with my family. A mistake, which I have admitted and apologized for. Fair enough. But what you are about to learn is this. I am not here today to defend myself. I am here to present the official record of your ethics violations. Your family's enrichment, and your champagne socialist lifestyle, funded by the very corporate interests you claim to fight. The projection screen behind him lit up again. A devastating split image that would be replayed on every news channel for weeks. On the left, AOC at the Met Gala, smiling in her, tax the rich, dress. On the right, the cover of the official House Ethics Committee report. The words violations found highlighted in red. Gasps rippled through the room. Cruz stood and moved to the screen, the laser pointer in his hand. Last year, he began, his voice taking on the methodical tone of a professor. The House Ethics Committee, a bipartisan body of 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, completed its investigation into your attendance at the Met Gala. He clicked, and the photo of AOC in the gown enlarged. Her smile captured forever. For those unfamiliar, this is one of the most exclusive and expensive social events in the world. A celebration of wealth and celebrity. Turn that off. Ocasio-Cortez surged to her feet. This is nothing but a... The chairman's gavel came down like a gunshot. Congresswoman, the senator has the floor. You will have your opportunity to respond. Please be seated. She remained standing for a moment, gripping the table, before sinking back into her chair, defeated. Cruz continued as if she hadn't spoken. He walked the room through the timeline, his laser pointer a small, red dot of accusation. September 2021. The Congresswoman attends the Met Gala. She wears a custom-designed gown. She receives professional hair, makeup, and jewelry styling. She brings her boyfriend, Riley Roberts, as her +1. She tells the world she is there to make a statement, to crash the party of the elite. He paused. Except she wasn't crashing anything. She was an invited guest of the very people she was supposedly there to protest. He clicked to the next slide. 2022. Questions begin to be asked. Who paid for all this? The dress, the styling, the ticket for her boyfriend? The Congresswoman assures everyone on Twitter and through her press secretary. It's all handled. Don't worry. His voice dropped slightly. Except it wasn't handled. She didn't pay. Not fully. Not honestly. He clicked again. 2023. The Office of Congressional Ethics begins a formal investigation. They start looking at receipts. They start following the money. And they find. Cruz turned to face Ocasio-Cortez directly. That you accepted gifts you were not legally entitled to accept. You took thousands of dollars in services and goods. And you only began to partially pay for them after the investigation was launched. This is a distraction, she exploded. The words a desperate, reflexive defense. You're manufacturing a scandal to avoid discussing the climate crisis. July 2025. Cruz spoke over her, his voice calm but firm. Last month, the bipartisan House Ethics Committee released its findings. Not allegations, findings. He picked up the thick, bound report from his table. He adjusted his glasses and read with careful precision. Quote, the committee finds that Representative Ocasio-Cortez violated House rules by accepting impermissible gifts associated with her attendance at the Met Gala in 2021. He looked up, over the top of his glasses. Not, allegedly violated, not, may have violated. Violated, past tense, confirmed, official. The gallery erupted in murmurs. The progressives who had come to cheer her on now looked shell-shocked. Some were already quietly edging toward the exits, unable to watch their idol's public destruction. The trap had been sprung. But as Ted Cruz reached for the next page of the report, it was clear that the execution had only just begun. The word, violated, hung in the air. An official, bipartisan judgment that could not be spun or dismissed. The energy had completely inverted. The room, once a roaring cauldron of support for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was now a silent, sterile courtroom, and she was the one in the dock. Her supporters who remained sat stunned. Their tax the rich t-shirts now looking like costumes from a play that had taken a dark, unexpected turn. But let's get specific, Ted Cruz said, moving to a new slide on the projector. Let's talk about Riley Roberts. A photo appeared on the screen. Mr. Roberts in his tuxedo, smiling nervously beside Ocasio-Cortez at the gala. The congresswoman's boyfriend at the time. Cruz narrated, now her fiancé. I understand. Congratulations on the engagement. By the way, the polite, almost cheerful aside was a masterstroke of cruelty. A touch of normality that made the subsequent indictment all the more brutal. House rules are exceptionally clear about this. Cruz continued, members of Congress may accept a second, complimentary ticket to charitable events for a spouse or a dependent child. The text of the House rule itself appeared on screen. Stark and unambiguous. Notice the specificity. Spouse or dependent child. The rule does not say boyfriend. It does not say partner. It does not say significant other. He let that sink in. But you brought him anyway. You secured him a free ticket to an event where admission costs tens of thousands of dollars. Ocasio-Cortez's voice was shrill. Desperate. We've been together for years. We live together. We're practically. But you were not married. Cruz responded with devastating calm. And here is where a simple ethics violation deepens into a pattern of deliberate deception. New documents flashed on the screen, official forms. Side by side, damning in their contradiction. On some official paperwork, Cruz explained, as a red circle appeared around a word on one form. Specifically, the paperwork submitted to the Met Gala organizers. You listed Mr. Roberts as your spouse. This is what secured his complimentary admission. He then pointed to the adjacent document. But on other, far more serious paperwork, your annual congressional financial disclosure forms. The ones where you are legally required to report the income and assets of a spouse. You did not list him as your spouse. A red circle highlighted the empty space where a spouse's information would go. The room erupted in murmurs. The contradiction was too blatant, too cynical to ignore. So which is it, Congresswoman? Cruz's voice was level, almost curious. Is Mr. Roberts your spouse when it gets him into a fancy party? But not your spouse when it would require financial transparency? He gets the benefits of being a spouse, the free ticket, the access, but you avoid the legal responsibility of disclosing his finances. He is, it would seem, a Schrodinger's spouse. He simultaneously exists and does not exist in a state of matrimony, depending entirely on which form you are filling out. The hypocrisy was so perfectly illustrated that even some of the reporters in the press gallery could be seen shaking their heads in disbelief. And this isn't just about a party. Cruz continued, pulling out another photo like a magician with an endless supply of damning evidence. It showed Riley Roberts wearing the distinctive circular pin that identified him as having congressional credentials. Your boyfriend, your sometimes spouse, has had a congressional pin since you first took office. He explained to the room what the pin signified. This isn't a souvenir. It grants access to restricted areas of the United States Capitol, to secure corridors where sensitive information is discussed, to elevators reserved for members and their families. It is a key to the inner sanctum of our government, reserved for elected officials and vetted staff. He turned back to face her. You gave your boyfriend, a private citizen with no official role, Unrestricted access to the Capitol for years. It was just so he could see my calendar, she protested. Falling back on an old, discredited talking point. A calendar? Cruz asked, his voice laced with incredulity. Then perhaps you can explain this. The screen changed to show the details of an official House email account. Riley.roberts@mail.house.gov. This is not calendar access. This is a full, official House of Representatives email account, granting him the ability to send and receive correspondence from a government server. To be included on official communications. Again, a privilege reserved for spouses and official staff. And again, you listed him as your spouse to get him these privileges, while refusing to list him as a spouse on the forms that would require you to be transparent about his finances. The pattern was now brutally clear. It was not a series of isolated mistakes or lapses in judgment. It was a calculated, long-term strategy to exploit the privileges of her office for personal and familial benefit, while simultaneously evading the transparency and ethical rules that came with it. Cruz returned to his table, organizing his papers with deliberate care. He closed the folder related to the Met Gala with a soft thud that somehow sounded final. He then reached for another folder. This one thicker, heavier. But Congresswoman, he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. The quiet tone of a doctor about to break the worst possible news. The Met Gala, the dress, the hypocrisy, that was just the opening act. He pulled out bank statements, payment records, and Federal Election Commission filings. Let's discuss your boyfriend again, Cruz said, specifically. Let's talk about the $6,000 your campaign funneled to him through a political action committee that you control. Ocasio-Cortez made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Her worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. The careful compartmentalization she had maintained, the Met Gala scandal over here, the boyfriend payments over there, was collapsing. Cruz was connecting the dots, revealing that it wasn't just a series of isolated scandals, but a single, overarching story of a corrupt lifestyle, and they were only just beginning to tell it. The revelation of the boyfriend payments hung in the air, a new and more sordid layer added to the unfolding scandal. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked from Cruz to the screen, her face a mask of panic. This was not about a fancy dress or a party, this was about campaign funds. A subject overseen by the Federal Election Commission and governed by strict laws. Let's talk about pass-through payments, Cruz continued, his voice still calm, still methodical, utterly devastating. Let's talk about using intermediaries to hide where campaign money is really going. The screen behind him lit up with a flowchart, simple enough for anyone to understand, and damning enough to end a political career. Let me show you how the money moved, Cruz said, using his laser pointer to trace the path. A box labeled AOC campaign appeared. An arrow led from it to a second box, Brand New Congress PAC. In August of 2017, your campaign writes a check for over $6,000 to a political action committee called Brand New Congress PAC. An arrow led from the PAC to a third box, Riley Roberts. Days later, Cruz emphasized, not weeks or months, but days. This PAC writes a check to your boyfriend, Riley Roberts, for $3,000. The flowchart completed its loop. Another arrow from the AOC campaign to the PAC, representing a second payment, and a final arrow from the PAC back to Riley Roberts, for another $3,000. Money goes in a circle, Cruz said simply, stepping back from the screen to let the image sink in. From your donors, working people who gave you $50 they could barely afford, through a PAC. And straight into your boyfriend's bank account. Ocasio-Cortez exploded from her chair. He did work. He's a legitimate marketing consultant. He provided real services for that money. Cruz didn't even blink. He just looked at her with the infinite patience of a man who had anticipated this exact defense. Show us the work. The room fell silent. Show us one advertisement he created. Cruz continued, his voice quiet but relentless. One social media strategy document. One marketing campaign. One email blast. Show us any evidence that he actually did anything for that money, other than deposit the checks. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, then damning. Ocasio-Cortez stood, her mouth open, but she had nothing to offer. You can't, Cruz stated, because the work doesn't exist. Only the payments exist. $6,000. Gone from your donors' pockets and into your boyfriend's. For services that cannot be proven. The PAC has every right to hire whatever consultants it chooses, she shot back. Her voice cracking. This is standard procedure. Who runs brand new Congress PAC? Cruz asked gently, as a new photo appeared on the screen. It was Saikat Chakrabarti, Ocasio-Cortez's former campaign manager and then chief of staff. A key architect of her insurgent rise. Your former chief of staff. Cruz clarified for the record. The man who ran your campaign. Co-founded this PAC, and managed its finances. He approved the payments. He let that connection settle. So, your chief of staff runs a PAC. Your campaign pays that PAC. That PAC then pays your boyfriend. Your chief of staff approves the payments to your boyfriend. He looked directly at her. Are you telling this committee that you didn't know? That your own chief of staff was funneling campaign money to the man you live with? And you were completely, utterly unaware? He paused. Because if you did know, that's corruption. And if you didn't know, that's incompetence on a staggering scale. He tilted his head. Which is it, Congresswoman? Corrupt, or incompetent? Before she could answer, he produced another official document. The Federal Election Commission received a formal complaint about these payments. Let me read from it. He adjusted his glasses. The timing and amounts of these transactions. The use of affiliated entities as intermediaries. And the romantic relationship between Ocasio-Cortez and Riley Roberts collectively establish reason to believe these transactions may have violated campaign finance law. He looked up. That is the carefully worded, legal way of saying this looks like money laundering. A young Latina woman stood in the gallery, her voice shaking with an emotion that was part anger, part heartbreak. Security moved toward her, but Cruz again raised his hand. Let her speak. I volunteered for your campaign, she said, tears streaming down her face. I knocked on doors in the Bronx. I donated money I couldn't afford because I believed in you. Ocasio-Cortez looked at her, and the panic in her eyes intensified. This was worse than Cruz's attacks. This was betrayal from one of her own. I gave you $50 when I had $60 in my bank account. The young woman cried, because you said you were different. You said you cared about people like me. I ate ramen for a month because I believed in you. And you were paying your boyfriend? You were wearing designer dresses to galas? She wiped her face with her sleeve, her voice hardening with disgust. You're a fraud. You're worse than the Republicans. Because at least they don't pretend to be one of us. She turned and stormed toward the exit. Others followed her, young, disillusioned progressives, their faces a mixture of betrayal and shame. The gallery was half empty now. The squad had quietly slipped away. AOC sat alone, her carefully constructed image of an authentic, working-class champion shattering in real time. Cruz closed the folder on the boyfriend payments with deliberate finality. He reached for another, his expression shifting from prosecutorial to something harder to read, almost sad. Congresswoman, he said quietly, everything so far has been about money, about greed, about personal hypocrisy, standard political scandals. Really, but the pattern of deception isn't just personal. It has had devastating consequences for the very people you claim to represent. He opened the new folder slowly. The screen behind him went black, then lit up with a stark, split image. On the left was a news headline from 2019. AOC celebrates as Amazon cancels NYC headquarters. On the right, another headline from the same week, 25,000 jobs lost. Let's go back to 2019, shall we? Cruz said, his voice low. Let's talk about Amazon. The committee room was a tomb of broken narratives. The story of the authentic outsider, the story of the incorruptible champion, had been systematically dismantled. What remained was the quiet, damning evidence of petty graft and hypocrisy. But Ted Cruz was not finished. He was about to escalate his attack from personal enrichment to an accusation of profound and lasting harm done to the very people Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez claimed to represent. He gestured to the screen, where the stark, split image reappeared. AOC celebrating, juxtaposed with the headline 25,000 jobs lost. Let's go back to 2019. Cruz began, his voice taking on the tone of a historian recounting a great and tragic mistake. Amazon announces it will build its second headquarters, HQ2, in New York City, a second Silicon Valley on the East Coast. He painted a picture of the promise: 25,000 high-paying jobs. Not 100, not 1,000, 25,000. 25,000 paychecks, 25,000 families with a foothold in the middle class. Billions of dollars in new tax revenue to fund schools, subways, and infrastructure. A video played on the screen, Ocasio-Cortez at a rally. Megaphone in hand, her face a mask of righteous fury. We don't need their dirty money. We don't need Jeff Bezos. We don't need corporate greed in our neighborhoods. She became the face of the resistance. Cruz narrated over the clip. She organized protests. She lobbied other politicians. It was a beautiful narrative. David fighting the corporate Goliath. And she won. The screen showed her triumphant tweet from the day Amazon pulled out. Anything is possible. Today was the day a group of dedicated, everyday New Yorkers defeated Amazon's corporate greed. She celebrated. Cruz said flatly. She threw a party. But who really won? Not the construction crews who would have built the facility. Not the small businesses that would have thrived. And certainly not the 25,000 families who needed those jobs. Those weren't real jobs, Ocasio-Cortez shouted, her voice laced with desperation. They were corporate welfare. Tell that to the single mother who could have earned enough to move out of her cramped apartment. Cruz countered quietly. Principals don't pay rent, Congresswoman. He then produced an aged document. But here is where the hypocrisy becomes truly breathtaking. In 2012, a young entrepreneur named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, running a small children's book publisher, applied for, he held the document to the camera, tax breaks, business incentives, and government subsidies, the exact same type of benefits she attacked Amazon for seeking. Tax breaks for her own small business? Good and necessary. Tax breaks for a company creating 25,000 jobs? Evil corporate greed. The hypocrisy was so blatant it drew a low groan from the few remaining people in the gallery. Worse, Cruz continued, was her justification. She tweeted that by rejecting Amazon, the city could now invest those $3 billion in tax incentives elsewhere. He shook his head. That's not how tax incentives work. The money doesn't exist. It's a future tax you agree not to collect in exchange for economic growth. The mayor tried to explain it to her. The governor tried to explain it. Economists tried to explain it. But she refused to understand. Or refused to admit she was wrong. She cost her city 25,000 jobs based on a fundamental misunderstanding of high school economics. He pivoted. But her hypocrisy is not limited to just one company. Let's talk about Tesla. A video played of AOC at a town hall, passionately attacking Tesla and Elon Musk for receiving government subsidies. We gave money to Tesla, and we got no return on our investment. She made it crystal clear. Cruz said, Tesla, bad. Government subsidies to Tesla, bad. He paused. 2 years later, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez buys a Tesla Model 3, a luxury vehicle that costs what many Americans make in an entire year. The gallery erupted in a burst of bitter, disbelieving laughter. Photos appeared of her Tesla parked around Washington, D.C. Her defense, Cruz noted, was that it was the only EV that could get me from New York to Washington on one charge. A detailed comparison chart appeared on screen. That is demonstrably false. At the time of her purchase, there were 17 other electric vehicles on the market. 8 of them had equal or better range than her Tesla. Most cost significantly less, and several were made by American union workers. But they didn't have the same status. Did they? They weren't the car that says, I've made it. He zoomed in on one photo. And where does she park this symbol of her environmental virtue? Here, outside a Whole Foods. He let the name sink in. Whole Foods, the grocery store owned by Amazon. The same Amazon she drove out of New York. She attacks a company, kills 25,000 jobs for her constituents, and then gives that same company her business. He zoomed in further, and she's parked in a no parking zone. Rules for thee, but not for me. Cruz's expression shifted, becoming more somber, more personal. He closed the folder on Amazon and reached for a new one. On the tab, written in his own hand, was a single word: abuela. Everything we've discussed so far, Congresswoman, is about hypocrisy, greed, and policy, standard political scandals. But this next part is different. This is about family. This is about the values you weaponize for political gain. A photo appeared on the screen. It showed an elderly woman standing in a room with a collapsed ceiling. Buckets on the floor to catch the dripping rainwater. "Let's talk about your grandmother," Cruz said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Ocasio-Cortez closed her eyes. Her hands gripped the table. The kill shot was coming, and there was nowhere left to hide. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez closed her eyes, but the image was seared onto the back of her eyelids. A split screen of her own making. On one side, the opulence of the Met Gala, a fantasy of white silk and defiant red letters. On the other, the stark, brutal reality of her grandmother's home in Puerto Rico, a collapsed ceiling, water-stained walls, and buckets on the floor to catch the rain. The contrast was a silent, screaming indictment. Ted Cruz's voice was quiet now, almost gentle, the tone of a man delivering a eulogy. June 2021. He began. The Congresswoman tweets about her grandmother, her abuela. Her own tweet appeared on the screen. The words she had typed herself now turned into weapons against her. "Just over a week ago, my abuela fell ill. I went to Puerto Rico to see her. This is her home. Hurricane Maria relief hasn't arrived. Trump blocked relief for PR. People are being forced to flee ancestral homes." Below the text were the very photos of the ruined house now displayed on the screen. "She posted these photos," Cruz narrated. "She blamed President Trump. She called it a systemic failure of government. She talked about how Puerto Rico had been abandoned." He paused, looking up from his notes. "And you know what? She was partially right. The hurricane relief was inadequate. The response was slow. There were real failures." Ocasio-Cortez's head snapped up. Was he agreeing with her? For a fleeting second, a flicker of hope appeared in her eyes. But then, Cruz continued, extinguishing that hope. The American people started asking a reasonable, obvious question. He gestured to the screen, where a cascade of replies to her original tweet now scrolled. "Why aren't you helping her?" One read, "You make almost $200 a year." Another said, "You wear designer clothes and drive a luxury car. Why is your grandmother living like this while you live like a queen?" "You tried to explain it away," Cruz said. "You tweeted that it wasn't about personal responsibility, but about systemic problems. But we understand perfectly, Congresswoman. We understand that you chose to use your grandmother's suffering as a political prop." He set down his notes and spoke directly to her, his voice taking on a new, personal gravity. "I am a Cuban American. In our culture, in your culture, familia comes first. It comes before politics, before career, before everything." His own voice caught slightly with genuine emotion. "My grandmother, my abuela, I would have lived in a cardboard box myself before I allowed her to live in a house with a collapsed roof. That is not heroic. That is not exceptional. That is simply the bare minimum of being a decent human being." He looked at her, and she could not meet his gaze. "You make more money than 90% of Americans. You have resources and privilege. And your own grandmother, the woman who helped raise you, the living symbol of the heritage you claim to champion, was living in ruins." Tears started to form in Ocasio-Cortez's eyes. But they were not the tears of a righteous warrior. They were the tears of a privileged woman being called to account for a profound moral failure. "But Congresswoman," Cruz's voice dropped to a near whisper, "it gets so much worse." New screenshots appeared on the screen, this time from a GoFundMe page. "Conservatives saw your grandmother's plight," Cruz explained. "People you attack every single day on Twitter. A man named Matt Walsh, a conservative commentator you have called a fascist, decided to do something. He started a GoFundMe campaign to repair your grandmother's home." The total amount raised appeared on the screen, a number so staggering it drew gasps from what was left of the audience. $104.153. Over $100,000. Cruz repeated, letting the number sink in. Raised in a matter of hours. From strangers. From the very people you call your enemies. Enough money to completely rebuild her home. To give her safety, comfort, and dignity in her final years. He paused, his eyes fixed on her, the silence stretching to an unbearable length. And your family rejected it. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. The air itself seemed to turn to lead. You refused the money, Cruz stated, his voice a flat declaration of fact. You told GoFundMe you would not accept the donations. The campaign was shut down. Not one penny of that $100,000 was allowed to go to your grandmother. A Puerto Rican woman in her 60s stood in the gallery, her voice shaking with a rage that was both personal and cultural. My abuela is everything to me, she shouted. I work 3 jobs to help support her. I clean houses. I serve tables. I do overnight shifts. You make more in a month than I make in a year. And you let your own grandmother suffer in a broken house? Her voice broke with a sob of pure contempt. You are no Boricua. You are no familia. You are just another rich politician who forgot where she came from. She turned and walked out, half the remaining gallery following her in a silent exodus of disgust. Cruz waited for the door to close before continuing, his voice now laced with a sad, weary disappointment. Do you know why your family rejected the money, Congresswoman? Because accepting help from conservatives would have damaged your political brand. It would have complicated your narrative. Your grandmother could have had a safe, dry home, but that would have required you to admit that your political opponents are capable of human decency. And that admission, that single crack in your ideological armor, was more threatening to you than your own grandmother's suffering. He shook his head slowly. You chose your image over your abuela's safety. He walked to a whiteboard and did the simple, brutal math. Your congressional salary, after taxes, is roughly $130. The estimated cost to repair your grandmother's home was about $20. You could have fixed her house with less than 2 months of your paycheck and still had plenty of money left over for your Tesla payments and your designer clothes. But you didn't. Instead, you tweeted photos of her squalor for political points. He returned to his seat, his case on this front all but complete. You preach socialism, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Your grandmother had a need. You had the ability, but you refused. You demand the rich pay their fair share, but you wouldn't contribute your own fair share to your own family. It is the ultimate hypocrisy, socialism for thee, but not for me. He stood and walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. You talk endlessly about privilege, Congresswoman, but look at you. Designer clothes, a luxury car, exclusive parties with billionaires, a congressional boyfriend with special privileges, and your own flesh and blood, living in ruins. You are not fighting the system. You are the system. You are the privilege you claim to fight. You are the inequality you claim to oppose. You are the powerful exploiting the powerless. He returned to his seat. I came here today not to defend my trip to Cancun. That's fair criticism. I made a mistake, and I've owned it. I came here to show America who you really are. He looked at her with what might have been a flicker of pity. Not a revolutionary, not a champion of the people, but a champagne socialist, an elite playing dress up as a radical, a privileged person weaponizing other people's suffering, including your own grandmother's, for personal gain and political advancement. You are exactly what you claim to despise. And now, finally, everyone knows it. The committee room had transformed in the space of 4 hours. The change was so dramatic it was almost architectural, as if the space itself had physically altered to reflect the devastation that had occurred within it. What had begun as a packed, standing room only theater of revolution, faces full of hope and righteous anger. The squad flanking their leader like an honor guard had become a near-empty tomb. The squad had slipped out through the back, one by one, first Ilhan, then Rashida, then Ayanna, each finding urgent business elsewhere as the revelations mounted. The progressive supporters who remained looked shell-shocked, staring at their phones, grappling with the cognitive dissonance of watching their idol be exposed as everything they claimed to hate. The press corps, in contrast, was a hive of frantic activity, fingers flying across keyboards, documenting every second of a political death. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat alone at her table, completely, utterly alone. She had taken off her designer jacket at some point, and it now lay crumpled on the chair behind her. Her silk blouse was wrinkled and sweat-stained. The professional makeup, applied that morning to project an image of power, was now a ruin, streaked with tears and perspiration. She had stopped looking up, stopped fighting, her gaze fixed on the scattered papers before her. Her phone, face down on the table, buzzed incessantly, each vibration another nail in her political coffin. A reporter in the press gallery, a young man, audibly gasped as he looked at his phone, showing his screen to the person next to him. A wave of realization spread through the room as others checked their own feeds. The projection screen, which had been Cruz's primary weapon all day, came to life one more time. But this time, it wasn't Cruz controlling it. It was a committee staffer, displaying what was happening in real time on social media. The trends on X, formerly Twitter, were a digital autopsy. Hashtag AOC exposed was #1 worldwide. Hashtag Champagne Socialist was #2. Hashtag AOC hypocrisy and hashtag AOC grandmother were not far behind. The platform she had masterfully used to build her brand was now being used to tear it apart. Tweets scrolled by, a relentless cascade of betrayal and fury from her own supporters. I donated to her campaign when I had $73 in my account, while she was paying her boyfriend and wearing designer dresses. I feel like a fool. My abuela is my world. I work 2 jobs to help her. AOC makes over $170,000 and let hers live in ruins. Disgusted. The tax the rich dress while accepting undisclosed gifts from the rich is the perfect metaphor for her entire career. The organizational responses rolled in like a tidal wave. Justice Democrats, the group that had recruited her, issued a statement. We are reviewing the allegations and take all ethics concerns seriously. The Democratic Socialists of America, members are expected to uphold the highest standards of integrity. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, all members must be held to the same ethical standards. The carefully worded, clinical language was a brutal political shunning. The message was clear. You are on your own. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood one final time. Her legs were shaky, her voice hoarse from hours of shouting and crying. She looked like a fighter who had been battered beyond recognition but was still trying to land one last desperate punch. This, she began, her voice cracking. This is what they do to strong women of color who dare to challenge the system. They attack us. They use racism and sexism to destroy anyone who dares to speak truth to power. Before she could continue, a black woman in the gallery stood up. She was dressed professionally, her expression one of profound, weary disappointment. Don't do that, the woman said, her voice measured but firm, carrying an authority that instantly silenced the room. Don't you dare hide behind us. Don't use women of color as your shield when you get caught being corrupt. She stepped into the aisle, making sure Ocasio-Cortez could see her. I'm a black woman. I work 2 jobs to take care of my mother who has MS. I have been fighting for real change my whole life. And I have never taken a dime I wasn't entitled to. Her voice hardened. What you did, that's not about being a woman. That's not about being Latina. That's about being corrupt. That's about being a hypocrite. Own it. Take responsibility. Stop hiding behind your identity when you get called out for your actions. She turned and walked out, her head held high. Her exit was more powerful than any speech. The few remaining AOC supporters looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion, anger, and betrayal. They followed the woman out, one by one, an exodus of the disillusioned. The committee chairman banged his gavel one final time. This hearing will adjourn for the day. The committee will reconvene tomorrow to discuss appropriate sanctions. Sanctions. The word hung in the air. Official, permanent, and career-ending. Ocasio-Cortez, trembling, tried to gather her scattered papers. But her hands were shaking too badly. They slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. She gave up, leaving them there like the ruins of her career. Her chief of staff was nowhere to be seen. She walked toward the exit, each step requiring a monumental effort. In the hallway, a group of young Latinas wearing Boricua Power t-shirts saw her coming. One by one, they turned their backs on her. A silent, devastating protest. The photographers were waiting, not the friendly campaign photographers, but the vultures who document political death. She tried to cover her face, but it was too late. The image was immortalized, Disheveled. Crying. Broken. Alone. Her legacy. Rewritten in the space of 4 brutal hours. Not the voice of a generation. But just another hypocrite who got caught. The walk from the committee room to the exit of the Rayburn House office building is a short one. On any other day, it would have taken Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez less than 5 minutes. But on this day, it was a journey through the 9 circles of a political hell she had created for herself. The hallway was a gauntlet of cameras. The photographers, who had once clamored for her smiling, confident image, now fought for the most devastating shot of her ruin. The relentless flash of their strobes was a disorienting, percussive assault. She tried to cover her face, but it was useless. The images were already captured and being beamed across the world. The disheveled hair, the tear-streaked makeup, the hollow, 1,000-yard stare of a person whose soul had been publicly excavated. When she finally emerged from the building onto the street, there was no waiting black SUV, no staffer holding the door. Her entire operational infrastructure had evaporated in the space of an afternoon. She stood alone on the curb, a pariah, as a crowd of her own former supporters, the same young progressives who had chanted her name just hours ago, now shouted questions filled with a hurt and betrayed anger. Why did you lie to us? What happened to our donations? You were supposed to be different. She had no answers. She couldn't even meet their eyes. She pulled out her phone to call a taxi. A final, humiliating act of a powerless woman stranded in the city she had once believed she could conquer. When the cab finally arrived, the driver, a man with a worn face and weary eyes, recognized her immediately. "Hey, you're that congresswoman," he said, his voice flat, devoid of awe. He just shook his head and looked away, his silence a more damning verdict than any shout. The ride to her apartment was a silent journey through a city that now seemed alien and hostile. News alerts lit up her phone screen, each one a fresh torment. AOC's career in ruins after devastating hearing. Democrats scramble to distance themselves from Ocasio-Cortez scandal. #champagne socialist trends worldwide. She arrived at her congressional office building hoping to find a sanctuary, a place to regroup. Instead, she found a scene of total chaos. Staffers were carrying out boxes, their faces grim, avoiding her gaze. Her chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, the man who had orchestrated her rise and the flow of money to her boyfriend, was frantically feeding documents into an industrial shredder. "Saikat?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. He looked up, and there was no loyalty in his eyes, only the cold, hard glint of self-preservation. "Got to protect myself, Alex," he said, his voice flat. "The FBI will be here by morning. It's every man for himself now." He turned back to the shredder, the sound of grinding paper the only response. The final, most intimate betrayal was waiting on her phone. A text message from her fiancé, Riley Roberts, the man for whom she had bent and broken rules, the man at the center of so many of the day's revelations. It was short, clinical, and utterly final. "My lawyers will be in touch. I need to protect myself." The phone slipped from her trembling hand and clattered to the floor. 35 years old, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, the voice of a generation, and in a single afternoon, she had lost everything: her career, her credibility, her staff, her allies, her supporters, and now, the man she was supposed to marry. Meanwhile, in his own quiet office, Ted Cruz sat watching the news coverage, his face showing no satisfaction, only a deep and profound exhaustion. His aide entered, beaming. "Senator, you're a hero. They're calling it the most devastating political takedown in congressional history. The clips are everywhere." Cruz waved a weary hand. "Turn it off, son. There is no joy in this. I didn't come to Washington to destroy people. I came to expose the hypocrisy that is poisoning this country." He looked at a photograph on his desk, a picture of his own family, his own wife and daughters. She could have been authentic, he said quietly, more to himself than to his aide. She could have actually helped the people she claimed to represent. She had the platform, the passion, the opportunity. He closed the final folder, the one marked AOC investigation, with a soft, final thud. Instead, she chose the performance, the brand, the grift. He stood and stretched, The weight of the days settled deep in his bones. What a tragic waste of potential. As night fell over Washington, D.C., two political careers stood in stark contrast. One was in ruins, a monument to the corrosive power of hypocrisy and greed. The other was ascendant, not through ambition, but through the simple, devastating power of telling the truth. The revolutionary was dead, the icon was shattered, the brand was destroyed, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat alone in the darkness of her empty office, waiting for the consequences she had earned. The confrontation between Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Cruz was far more than a simple debate. It was a clinical and brutal dissection of two competing forms of modern political power. Ocasio-Cortez entered the hearing armed with the weapons of the digital age: performative fury, a loyal social media following, and a brand built on the narrative of a righteous outsider fighting a corrupt system. Her strategy was to create a viral, emotionally charged moment that would play well in edited clips on Twitter and cable news, reinforcing her image as a fearless warrior. It was a strategy that had served her well in countless other venues. But in the formal, evidence-based crucible of a congressional hearing, it proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Cruz, in contrast, came prepared not for a political rally, but for legal prosecution. His strategy was one of asymmetric warfare, refusing to engage on her chosen battlefield of emotion and instead luring her onto his own terrain of documented facts and legal statutes. His victory was not accidental, it was the result of several key tactical decisions. The first was the strategy of patience. Cruz's initial refusal to react to her barrage of insults was his most crucial move. It served as a political rope-a-dope, allowing Ocasio-Cortez to exhaust her emotional energy and, in the process, appear increasingly shrill and unprofessional to neutral observers. His calm, almost serene demeanor created a powerful visual contrast that framed him as the sober, credible adult in the room before he had even presented a single piece of evidence. He did not let her get under his skin, thereby refusing to cede control of the moment's emotional tenor. The second pillar was the power of tangible evidence. In a political era dominated by truthiness and abstract talking points, Cruz grounded his entire case in physical, verifiable documents: the manila folders, the highlighted ethics reports, the projector screen displaying Ocasio-Cortez's own contradictory forms and hypocritical tweets. These were not just props. They were anchors of reality in a sea of spin. He understood that while you can argue with an opponent's opinion, you cannot argue with your own signature on a financial disclosure form. By consistently returning to the documents, he transformed the hearing from a "he said, she said" debate into an evidence-based proceeding from which she could not escape. Finally, and most effectively, was his mastery of narrative sequencing. Cruz did not lead with his most damning evidence. He built his case layer by layer, leading his audience, and his target, through a structured deconstruction of her entire political identity. He began with lifestyle hypocrisy, the Met Gala, a visually powerful but non-criminal accusation that served to immediately undermine her brand as a champion of the working class. He then escalated to financial corruption, the boyfriend payments, moving from a question of ethics to one of potential illegality and misuse of campaign funds. From there, he pivoted to harmful policy impact, the Amazon HQ2 debacle, demonstrating that her political posturing had tangible, negative consequences for her own constituents. Only after establishing this comprehensive pattern of hypocrisy and harm did he deliver the moral coup de grace, the grandmother scandal. This was the final, devastating blow, a deeply personal and culturally resonant story that framed her not just as a hypocrite or a corrupt politician, but as a person who had betrayed the most fundamental values of family and decency for political gain. By the time he was finished, he had not just challenged her on a few points, he had systematically dismantled her entire public persona, proving that the authentic, revolutionary warrior was, in fact, a carefully constructed brand. Ocasio-Cortez came prepared for a street fight. Cruz, in turn, subjected her to a clinical, and ultimately fatal, autopsy. The broader implications of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's public implosion extend far beyond the career of a single politician. The event serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the inherent fragility of political brands built on performative activism and the weaponization of identity. especially when those brands are not supported by a foundation of personal integrity. At its core, the hearing exposed the critical weakness of performative activism. Ocasio-Cortez's power was largely derived from her ability to perform the role of a revolutionary. The tax the rich dress, the fiery speeches, the constant social media battles, these were acts of political theater designed to signal virtue and solidarity with a specific progressive tribe. This performance resonated powerfully with her base and made her a media sensation. However, as Cruz so effectively demonstrated, this style of activism is exceptionally vulnerable to accusations of hypocrisy. When it was revealed that the performer's real life, her acceptance of luxury gifts, her funneling of money to her boyfriend, her neglect of her own family, her choice of a luxury car, was in direct contradiction to the role she was playing, the entire edifice of her credibility collapsed. The hearing proved that an identity built on proclaiming one's virtue is uniquely susceptible to being destroyed by evidence of one's vice. Furthermore, the event highlighted the limits of identity as a political shield. A central part of Ocasio-Cortez's final, desperate defense was to frame the entire confrontation as an attack on her identity as a strong woman of color. This tactic, often effective in deflecting criticism within progressive circles, failed spectacularly in the broader public forum. It failed for two reasons. First, the evidence of her ethical lapses was so specific, documented, and non-ideological that it transcended identity politics. Financial documents and bipartisan ethics reports are not racist or sexist, they are simply facts. Second, and more powerfully, her attempt to use her identity as a shield was publicly rejected by other members of the very communities she claimed to represent, most notably the black woman and the Puerto Rican woman who stood up in the gallery to condemn her. They refused to allow her to use their shared identity to excuse her personal corruption. A moment that proved devastatingly effective in neutralizing her final line of defense. Finally, the saga serves as a powerful commentary on authenticity versus brand. Ocasio-Cortez's rise was fueled by a perception of authenticity. She was seen as a real, unfiltered voice in a world of polished, robotic politicians. The hearing, however, systematically replaced that perception of authenticity with the reality of a carefully managed brand. Cruz's most effective moments were when he juxtaposed the AOC brand with the actions of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The brand attacked corporate subsidies. While the individual bought a subsidized Tesla, the brand championed the working class. While the individual's campaign paid her boyfriend, the brand celebrated family and heritage. While the individual allowed her grandmother to live in squalor. The tragedy of her fall was not that a conservative senator defeated a progressive icon. It was that the promise of a new, more authentic kind of politics was revealed to be just another, more cleverly marketed version of the same old self-interest. The hearing did not just destroy a politician, it destroyed a powerful and seductive myth. It left her supporters, and a watching nation, to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that in the theater of modern politics, the most revolutionary costume may be hiding the most conventional of ambitions.